Good day everyone. I'll be discussing about what creates conflict. Social psychological studies have identified several ingredients of conflict. First, we have here the social dilemmas. Social dilemmas, these are the many problems that threaten our future nuclear arms, climate change, overpopulation, depleting fish stocks, natural resource depletion. So these social dilemmas arise as various parties pursue their self-interest. Now, let's consider two examples of the social trap. So, social trap, mo siya ang situation when conflicting parties are caught in mutually destructive behavior. So, ang two example ng social trap is the prisoner's dilemma and the tragedy of the commons. First, the prisoner's dilemma. This dilemma derives from an anecdote concerning two suspects being questioned separately by the district attorney. So, ang district attorney, kibaw siya na either sa duha kay guilty, so two suspect, but wa siya enough evidence to convict them of a lesser offense. So, the district attorney creates an incentive for each one to confess privately. First incentive is if prisoner A confesses and prisoner B doesn't, the district attorney will grant immunity to prisoner A and will use A's confession to convict B of a maximum offense, and vice versa if si B ang i-confess and si A ang wa. Second is if both confess, each nila will receive a moderate sentence. Last is if wala jud sa duha ang i-confess, each will be convicted of a lesser crime and receive a light sentence. I have provided a figure that summarizes the choices sa prisoner's dilemma. This is the classic prisoner's dilemma. So, if you were a prisoner faced with same situation ni prisoner A and prisoner B, or you're faced with such dilemma, nya, wa mo'y chance magkatabi sa usa ka prisoner, would you confess? No? So, confess ba ta? So, many people say they would confess to be granted immunity. So, as shown in the figure, no matter what the prisoner decides, each is better off confessing than being convicted individually. So, if ang usa sa imo confess, the sentence is moderate rather than severe. And if the other does not confess, one goes free. Next figure is for the laboratory version of the prisoner's dilemma. As shown in the figure, the numbers represent some reward, such as money, and in each box, the number above the diagonal lines is the outcome for person A. So, unlike sa classic prisoner's dilemma, kay most laboratory versions of prisoner's dilemma kay nag-involve siya og repeated plays. So, in this dilemma, kay kanang kuan siya university students, so nag-face sila og variation of prisoner's dilemma. So, ilang choices is being to defect or to cooperate. And ang outcome is dili sila maprisono, dili prison terms, but outcome is chips, money, or grade points. So, this dilemma often traps each one in a maddening predicament in which both realize they could mutually profit, but unable to communicate man sila. So, di man sila magkatabi. So, more result sila og mistrust, and mistrust become locked into not cooperating. The next example of the social trap is the tragedy of the commons. Commons is any shared resource like air, water, energy sources, and food supplies. A metaphor for the insidious nature of social dilemmas is what ecologist Garnett called the tragedy of the commons. So he derived the name the tragedy of the commons from the centrally located grassy pasture in old English towns. So, ang tragedy of the commons di ay may tabo ni siya when, example, ikaw baron ang imong rice, imong share sa bugas, kay you consume more than your share. So, the cost of your doing cause ultimate collapse to the tragedy of the commons. So, mo na siya ang whole idea sa the tragedy of the commons. So the following are the prisoner's dilemma and the tragedy of the commons' similar feature. First, the fundamental attribution error. So both games tempt people to explain their own behavior situationally and to explain their partner's behavior dispositionally. So like example, Muslims killed Americans. So ang Western media, they attributed the killings to evil dispositions like hateful terrorists. Pero when ang kanang American soldier killed Afghans, including children, he was said to be experiencing financial stress, frustrated by being passed over for a promotion. So, this idea explains that violence explanations vary by whether the act is by or toward one side. Second is evolving motives. So, sabotable naman siya, no? From the name itself, evolving motives. Motives often change. Example, at first, ganahan kita to make easy money, then ma-change sa imong motives to kana minimize losses, then to save face and avoid defeat. So, ang shifting motives mo depende siya sa kung unsay conflict na mo escalate. Third one is the outcomes need not sum to zero. So most real-life conflicts like prisoner's dilemma and tragedy of the commons are non-zero-sum games. When we say non-zero-sum games, games is siya in which outcomes need not sum to zero. With cooperation, both can win. With competition, both can lose. Non-zero-sum games, also called mixed motive situation. How can we resolve social dilemmas? So here are the following approach to resolving social dilemmas. In real-life situations, many people approach dilemmas with a cooperative motive, outlook, and expect similar cooperation from others, enabling collective betterment. So these are the several ways to further encourage mutual betterment. We have the regulation, small is beautiful, communication, changing the payoffs, and appealing to altruistic norms. First is the regulation. We also develop rules to safeguard our common good. Modern societies doesn't depend on charity to pay for school, parks, and social and military security. Like sa atong everyday life, regulation has cost of administering and enforcing regulations, and cost of diminished personal freedom. Next is small is beautiful. Another way to resolve social dilemmas, make the group small. Kay in a small commons or group, di ba, kay more likely responsible and effective ta if gamay ra ang sa group unlike to large groups. And if small ra, we feel more identified with group success. Next is the communication. So, to resolve a social dilemma, of course, dapat na itay communication. Mag-communicate siya, no? Because communication enables cooperation, and communication, saan ito pagkasinabot if dili ta mag-communicate, dili ta magtabi sa mga concerns sa group, like mga group discussions, and need ta mag-communicate to increase cooperation, devises group norms and expectations, and pressures members to commit themselves and follow and lead to common betterment. Next is changing the payoffs. Laboratory cooperation rises when experimenters change the payoff matrix to reward cooperation and helps resolve actual dilemmas. Last but not the least is appealing to altruistic norms. So appeal to altruistic motives prompt people to act for the common good. So as we have learned from previous discussions, attitude sometimes fail to influence behavior. Knowing what is good does not necessarily lead to doing what is good. So most people do adhere to norms of social responsibility, reciprocity, equity, and keeping one's commitments. And one way to this is through the influence of a charismatic leader who inspired to cooperate. Another way is by defining situations in a way that invoke cooperative norms. Last is communication can also activate altruistic norms. Competition. Competition kindles conflict. In competition fostering situations, groups act more competitively than do individuals. So, experiment. So, the experiment on competition's effect, we could randomly divide people into two groups. Have the groups compete for a scarce resource and note what happens. So that's all for my report. The next topic will be discussed by the next reporter. Thank you.
Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Trishali Sulibaga and I am assigned to discuss two more causes of conflicts which are perceived injustice and misperception. Let's begin with perceived injustice. So how can we say nga ang perceived injustice kay maong hinungdan nga na ay conflict? Kabantay mo ana nga feeling ninyo unfair na kaayong situation. Syempre, ang imo ma-feel jud ana kay malain or maglagot jud ka, so maong di magkasinabot. By the way, let's dive in kung unsa jud di ay ang justice. A sociologist stated that people perceive justice as equity. So what do you mean by equity? Equity is the distribution of rewards in proportion to individuals' contributions, meaning kung unsa lang imong nabuhat, mao lang sad imong madawat. For example, kanang sa grupo ninyo, mas daghan imong nabuhat para sa inyong activity kaysa sa uban nimo na kagrupo, pero mas dakoy lang grado sa imuha. So syempre malain ka ana. Another definition for justice is equality. So we are all very familiar naman kung unsa man jud ang equality. So next, last definition for justice kay fulfillment of needs. So naay mga tawo nga para nila ang justice kay naa sila'y makaon, naa sila'y mapuyan, naa sila'y mainom. Let's proceed to another causes of conflict, which is misperception. Many conflicts contain but a small core of incompatible goals. The bigger problem is the misperceptions of the other motives and goals. So here are the seeds of misperception. The first one is self-serving bias, which leads individuals and groups to accept credit for their good deeds and shirk responsibility for bad deeds. Second is a tendency to self-justify, which inclines people to deny the wrong of their evil acts. Next is the fundamental attribution error, and thanks to this, each side sees the other's hostility as reflecting an evil disposition. Next is to polarize. Groups frequently polarize these self-serving, self-justifying, biasing tendencies. Next is the groupthink. One of the symptoms of groupthink is the tendency to perceive one's own group as moral and strong, and the opposition as evil and weak. Acts of terrorism that in most people's eyes are despicable brutality are seen by others as holy war. Next is the in-group bias. The mere fact of being in a group triggers an in-group bias. Next is the negative stereotypes. Once formed are often resistant to contradictory evidence. Let's proceed to mirror image perception. So it refers to the reciprocal views of one another often held by parties in conflict. For example, each may view itself as moral and peace-loving and other as evil and aggressive. Next is the shifting perceptions. If perceptions accompany conflict, they should appear and disappear as conflicts, wask, and vain. That is all for my report.